Right. So we could probably go ahead and get started. For those that didn't read the emails or don't know, this is Alan Abeel. He is a Lehigh alum. He worked with Professor McSwain on some projects, and then moved into teaching for a little bit before jumping into contamination control engineering. And I'll let him take the floor from there.
Yeah. So yeah, so this is the Society of Physics Students, right? So the society was kind of starting up when I was an undergrad. I was at Lehigh from 2005 to 2009. I was an astrophysics major. And Professor McSwain was in like the hiring process during my junior and senior year. So I never got to take a class with her because she wasn't teaching classes until after I graduated. But I do remember her having to teach like mock classes as part of the interview process. Um, so I grew up in northern New Jersey. I went to a science and technology high school up in Bergen County and came to Lehigh 2005, College of Arts and Sciences. Kind of knew I wanted to major in astro and just started following the class routine that they had in the student handbook at the time. And I went through the astro program and I did a little bit of research with Professor McCluskey, who I'm sure is long retired by now. And I loved being at Lehigh. It was, four of the best years of my life. And the summer before my senior year, I got an internship here at the Goddard Space Flight Center, not through the physics department, but through the nanotechnology lab in engineering in PC Rawson. And when I got into the program, they basically took your resume and took all your write-ups and placed you somewhere. And somehow I got placed into the contamination control group. And they gave me some definitely fluffed up piece about how contamination control connected to astrophysics. But I came and did the internship and I fell in love with the place here. I did spent my summer mostly in clean rooms, which is how we build our spacecraft down here. I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with a clean room, but it's okay. You are. That's good. I see heads nodding. If not, it's basically a anything from a small lab up to a large manufacturing floor where the air and protocols in place for behavior inside the room are controlled to prevent any contamination of the hardware inside. Here at Goddard, we use protocols that require us to be gowned up head to toe, so just our eyes are open. And when I was an intern, they were still sort of developing the very early hardware and designs of the James Webb Space Telescope. So I got to see sort of the very beginning of that, but even cooler, in the large clean room here at Goddard, they were training some of the astronauts who were going up to do the final servicing mission of the Hubble Space Telescope. So they had this like fake Hubble inside the clean room, and the astronauts were in there gowned up. And, I was like getting gowned up next to an astronaut, didn't even realize it at the time. Someone had to tell me afterward. So came back to Lehigh, did my senior year, and applied to a whole bunch of grad schools, like 15 or 16. I got only into one of them. I got into just a master's program out at San Diego State University. So after graduation, after the summer, I packed up my stuff, drove my car out there, and lasted about 3 weeks out there and ended up leaving the program and dropping out of school and moving back to New Jersey, where I was in the midst of the worst economic recession since the Great Depression. So that was a great move. I left grad school for a couple reasons. One, I started to realize that going into research and academia was not really what I wanted to do. And when I started to weigh the financial obligations of going through the graduate program, they were just not, it just wasn't worth it for me. They were outweighed by the prospect of going back home and just going into industry and getting a job, and then perhaps going to graduate school later on. So I moved back to New Jersey and had a very tough time finding work. So I started to pursue my teaching certificate in New Jersey and was doing some tutoring and teaching some small like after school programs for a while in everything from like elementary school math up through SAT prep um, for math, physics, and science. And in the midst of that, in getting my teaching certificate, I ended up finding an engineering job at a small defense manufacturer up in Moonachie, New Jersey, which was pretty close to where I lived. And I worked there for a year and a half as what they call the project engineer. So you do a little bit of technical work and a little bit of project management. And the company I worked for built these small assemblies called slip rings, which allowed basically for you to pass an electrical current through a device that could rotate 360 degrees without twisting up your wires. So the products went into like helicopters, tank turrets, periscopes, basically anything that was electric that needed to spin in a complete circle without winding up, you needed a slip ring inside. So very cool at first, but in a kind of like a niche company like that, you end up just building the same thing over and over and over and over again. Can get a little boring, and you kind of get away from the technical work. Uh, so I grew up in New Jersey. I loved living there, but I didn't really want to spend the rest of my life in that job. And I had stayed in touch with my supervisors here at Goddard, and one July, they called me and said that they had an opening and asked if I would be interested in interviewing. And I drove down the next morning to do the interview, and um, it was very hot. I wore a black suit. That was a terrible idea. And in the middle of my interview, the fire alarm went off. So I had to go outside with like 100 people from the building, sweating in this black suit. And must have been like 95 degrees out that day, pretending that I was comfortable and trying to act professionally and just like drenched in sweat. But they gave me the job, and I moved down a couple months later after all the paperwork was processed. And I kind of jumped like right back into what I was doing with my internship in contamination control. But at this point, all of the like flight hardware, the spacecraft hardware itself for the James Webb Space Telescope that was being built by outside vendors was arriving. So like the first mirror segments of the flight telescope came in about 3 weeks after I started here at Goddard. And I had a really wonderful manager. She kind of managed by throwing her younger people into the fire and seeing like who could stick and who would get overwhelmed and leave. And I ended up sticking around for the rest of the mission. So I ended up working on the James Webb Space Telescope for 10 years. Um, from early assembly phases all through launch. I was one of the last handful of people to see it before it launched. Um, it was definitely a amazing experience through the whole time. Um, I cleaned every part of that telescope, including the mirrors themselves, the flight instruments inside, and I worked on monitoring the facilities. I did a lot of lab work for testing contamination on different parts of the telescope. And as I spent more time here, I started to get more management and leadership responsibilities on it. I traveled with it to Houston, Texas for a few years. I was going down there 1 to 2 weeks every month on a rotation with a couple other people. We went through our large thermal vacuum test in the vacuum chamber down there that had been used to train the Apollo astronauts, which was really cool. And then we took the telescope out to a Northrop Grumman facility in Los Angeles and did the final mate. They were building the solar panels and the sun shield there. And then we put it in a container and put it on a boat down to French Guiana in South America. Did our final processing and fueling down there and launched it. So at that point, my manager decided that she wanted me to be the team lead for the launch campaign in French Guiana. So for the years leading up to that, I had to write all the processing paperwork, build a training program, travel to French Guiana and back to meet with the local team there. I got to go to Paris a lot to meet with some of the European Space Agency management who was going to be overseeing the launch campaign and sort of develop those relationships, which was my favorite part of the whole experience, sort of building like cultural connections with the French and with people from South America, um, and get my team ready to be working down in that part of the world. And so did all the preparations, made a few trips, got like the lay of the land, made like a map of the local town for my team. And then COVID happened, and everyone was locked inside their homes for a while. Everyone was teleworking. Even here at Goddard, it was like, I would come in on some days. We were testing some equipment that we were bringing with us, and I wouldn't see like another person. Um, but most people here were teleworking through COVID. I was in about 50% of the time, getting stuff ready with a few other people. And eventually we were able to get people back into the clean rooms, finish building the telescope, and go down to French Guiana. So I lived there for about 4 months, setting up the facilities down there, receiving the telescope on its ship, unloading it, working the final integrations. There were some pieces that needed to be put on at the last minute, putting fuel inside of it, and then loading it onto the rocket, and ultimately closing the rocket and launching it. Um, One of the last activity before the rockets closed up with the telescope in it is to remove the purge supply. So science instruments are very delicate on the inside with a lot of mirrors, lenses, and they need to be kept clean and dry. Dry is very important because a lot of the lubricants that are used in space will get too wet on the ground. You end up with water. Water goes into space, gets cold, you get ice, and everything freezes. So our instruments are flooded with dry nitrogen uh, continuously. It's basically like filling up a balloon that never ends and has a little bit of leak. And so this is done until the very last minute inside the rocket, where you can pull it shut, basically pull that connection off, close the rocket, and then instead of flooding the instruments, you just flood the entire top of the rocket with dry gas. So that was the last activity on the telescope before the door was shut, and then it went out to the launch pad, and then I think it was a Christmas Day that year. It went up. I came back and did some like that's the point after a mission launches where you start writing like papers and lessons learned. So I published a couple papers on contamination control for the telescope, presented them at an international conference, and started working on my next projects. So I now work on the Nancy Roman Space Telescope, which is just really like the next big telescope that we're planning to launch in a few years. This project was like well underway when I joined on, so uh, we're a lot later in the development now than when I joined James Webb. So we're expecting to launch in like 2.5 years, which is great. And I've moved up into a leadership role. So now that the formal team lead, not just for one part of the team, but I am the lead contamination engineer on Roman. And I've done some like other leadership programs with NASA at the other centers. So I've been to most of the other NASA centers at this point, interacting with other people who work on different missions, different scientists and engineers, discussing leadership and how the agency sort of works together center to center. So not just within a project. So, my story is a little, I guess, unconventional in the beginning, being a grad school dropout, but ending up being a NASA engineer. I'd say it worked out pretty well. I'm pretty happy. Um, it's, I learned sort of the hard way. I didn't do much career prep when I was an undergrad, and I regret that. Um, I don't know that I had someone sort of advising me at all on how to think about my career as an undergrad, but I should have taken a little more initiative in doing so. And having done that, I probably would have figured out ahead of time that going into an astro grad program was not going to be for me. But I did learn that sometimes you make the wrong decision and it ends up working out anyway. So I know there's like an old proverb about that, but um, if I had to do everything again, knowing I'd end up here, I would do it all the same way. So, um, does anyone have any questions? There's a lot of talking.
Yeah, I guess, is there anything specific that you wish you would have had? Like any guidance to figure out what your career path would have been or career preparation? But is there, I don't know, what, I guess, in particular were you thinking of what helped you at that moment?
Yeah, so I didn't know too well what the options were coming out of the physics department at Lehigh other than going to graduate school and going into academia. Like when you go into industry as a physics student, um, depending on the industry you're looking at, if it's not like an engineering type job, they look for you to have a graduate degree. I mean, even if you think you want to end up on Wall Street doing like quantitative analysis for a hedge fund, they're really just looking at PhDs with physics degrees. Um, and I didn't know any better. So I thought everyone who graduated with a physics degree had to go get a graduate degree. When I first enrolled at Lehigh and decided that I wanted to be in the physics department, my high school guidance counselors had told me that, majoring in physics was sort of safe. You can use it in any field afterward. But I kind of got the opposite sense when I was an undergrad. And that was wrong. It was the wrong sense. Because my advisors were right. You can utilize it outside. But I didn't know any better. And I sort of wish the different possibilities were made more clear or just like offered. It's wonderful that you're all having discussions with alumni because you can get our different experiences and figure out like which career path might be best for you and get some sort of sense on lessons learned by us. But um, I didn't really have that when I was an undergrad. I didn't connect with alumni from the physics department. Um, I should have figured out to do that myself, but nobody that I was working, like none of the other students seemed to be doing it either. Everyone seemed to be just relying on summer internships or going through graduate school. And you know the advertisements for the REUs, I don't know if they're still doing those, the research experience for the undergrads. Those were like everything. Everyone was pushing you had to get an REU, and I applied to like every single one of them every year, and I never got one. And I wasn't a bad student. I got mostly A's in my classes, but I just never got one. And so I I didn't get a good sense before I graduated in what my different options were. So um, you know, it, I wish somebody had told me that you could just go right into engineering right afterward, but I didn't know. Now I do.
That's fair.
Yeah.
With your hindsight, I guess, are there any other fields that maybe aren't readily apparent that would be good for physics majors other than engineering? If you know.
Yeah, well, engineering is very broad, right? So I work in aerospace. Aerospace is often coupled with the defense industry just because a lot of the major companies do both. There's not a whole lot of profit in science, in developing science instruments. Um, if you look at a company like Lockheed Martin or Northrop Grumman, um, SpaceX, they're going to do most of their business through the DoD, through defense, because the defense industry has a ton more money to spend than NASA or like NOAA or the USGS does. Um, so for me, I do aerospace. You can basically go into any sort of technical field with a physics degree. You may have a harder time breaking in without connections. So uh, a lot of job applications are automated, right? So when you put in a resume online for especially a larger company organization, it's going to have to get filtered through an automated system first that's going to look for certain keywords and key phrases in your resume, in your cover letter, that sort of like they try to filter out the people who don't really qualify. Oftentimes they'll have you check, like put in your degree, your major, but if it's not a technical organization you're trying to work for, a physics major might get flagged in the front. So at that point, you'd want to have established a connection with somebody inside the organization who can like bypass that automated filter in the beginning. Education's a big one because there's never enough science and math teachers. And if that's something you're considering, I mean, that's something you can sort of try out before you do through internships or even just through like after school jobs. Um, you can get a taste of that to make sure it's what you want to do before you do it. And I think in many states now, they're desperate enough where they're not requiring you to have like an education degree right away to get into teaching. Um, Beyond that, the best I could say is you have to try and find other people with physics degrees who did it, uh, or who or started in a technical job and then used that as a bridge to get out of it. So most entry level technical engineering positions are going to be 100% technical. But as you spend more time inside of an organization in a group, if you choose to go like the management route, your job becomes much less technical and much more like people leading and project management and budgeting and scheduling. And that's a natural progression because organizations want the experienced people doing that. Not everyone does that. Some people choose to, some people don't. Just depends on the person. But I think if you're trying to get to work like right away with just your undergrad, not looking to go into academia, um, technical organizations are going to be your best bet. So I can only really speak to aerospace because that's the field that I know best. But um, energy is very big right now, especially renewable energy. So though that's probably a good booming place to go, that was not so prevalent when I was coming out.
Thank you.
Yep. Yeah.
I have, well, you mentioned earlier that you weren't like completely enticed by contamination control at first when you got that internship. What made you like stay with it, and what would you say are the benefits of that? Because the current career I'm looking at, I'm not completely enticed at all, but I love the
Okay.
organization, I love the people. Like, you know, it's a great engineering job, but I don't know if I love the work. So I just want to hear more about like that
Sure.
decision.
So when I first started in contamination control as an intern, I had no idea what contamination control was. That's not something you really learn about in college. Even in the engineering programs, in an aerospace engineering major, you may get like a very brief unit on contamination control. It's very specific to space and like semiconductors, pharma, and food production. And it's very different across those industries. Maybe a little similar between semiconductors and space, but very different than like the aseptic jobs or processing for food or pharmaceuticals. Um, so that was what made me a little like nervous at first. Like I had never even heard of this field. I knew nothing about it. NASA decided that this was a fit for me, but when I read the description, it sounded like somebody was really like bullshitting me about it. um, but when I learned, I learned a lot of it on the job, and I found that most people in it learn it on the job. And the group that I work with here, all the contamination engineering and technician staff that we have here kind of come from different technical backgrounds. We have some chemical engineers, we have biochemists. One of my coworkers was a virologist. She studied like coronavirus type diseases in school. Um, and so there's this like, I don't want to call it like an island of misfit toys here, but we all come from like different academic backgrounds and we learn this job on the job. And because there's not much of a curriculum for it in schools, we have to then pass it on as well. So we have to develop educational criteria to use within our branch. And a lot of that was shared with me when I started, and we've tried to keep that updated as we learn more. Um, but really, I was just loving the opportunity to work on like put my hands on stuff that was going to space. I thought that was like the coolest. I still do. I got to do that this morning, so uh, so for me, it's just I knew why I got into astrophysics to begin with. I really liked space. I really liked the science in space. I knew after college that I was not going to be an astronomer and I was not going to be the one doing the research that these machines were going to enable. But if I could get my hands into the experience anyway, in a more hands-on way, actually, that was actually more fulfilling for me. So the like in like the unique aspects of contamination control, the scientific part of it, it's not very exciting. Um, it's very broad though. So we start on missions when they say like they're still the back of a cocktail napkin design. Contamination is roped in right in the beginning because you need to make sure that your initial design is not going to break itself once it gets to space. We have to vet all the materials that are used, that are selected to build spacecraft, and then we have to process them in a space-like environment before they can even be used to build space parts. So we have a bunch of thermal vacuum chambers here that are as small as a shoebox up to the size that can fit a large space telescope. And we run tests on all materials and all subcomponents in a space. Basically, we simulate space. And we make sure that these materials are going to hold up in the environment of space. If there are mechanisms inside, that they're going to actuate as they're designed, and for the science instruments, that they're going to capture the light and process it into data as they're designed to do when in space. So we get to do all of that. Then we help process assemble the telescopes basically, and the other satellites. I work on telescopes, but we build all sorts of satellites here. And we're in it through all of those phases up until launch. We're always one of the last few people to interact with a telescope or a satellite before a fairing goes. We have to monitor the environment inside of a rocket while it's on the pad before it launches, and we get that data real time and have to be ready to flag an issue if it comes up. So I don't know that I, love contamination control itself, but I love the opportunity that it gives me. That makes
Yeah.
sense.
No, yeah, that's a great answer. Thank you.
Yeah. What job are you looking for? Are you
So I'm a pretty, sorry, my situation is pretty similar. I have a co-op right now with Fermilab, and I'm a cryogenic engineer, which again, I didn't really know much about it before I got on the job, and it's mostly taught like through the co-op on the job.
Yeah.
And I really love working at Fermi, and I love my coworkers, and I love that I get to like put my hands on like cool projects. But yeah, I'm not really sure what I want to do with engineering yet. I definitely want to like build things, and for now I just want more opportunities to do that. But I told my managers that, and they're giving me more projects that are like hands-on, so
Okay.
I'll see how it goes with it so far. But I just was trying to figure out, like what makes you stick with the job even if you're not sure you love like specifically
Yeah.
cryogenics. But I love like what we do at Fermi, and I love being a part of it. So I don't know, anyways, sorry.
So
Yeah.
there's a lot to be said about liking the place you work and the people you work with, because you could have the greatest job in the world, but if you're miserable interacting with your coworkers or in an environment where you're not comfortable, it'll turn into the worst job in the world. And the opposite can be true too. If you're with the right people, you could be in you could be in a really poor country like French Guiana for 4 months with no restaurants and one very poorly stocked supermarket and one hotel with doesn't have cleanable drinking water, and you've got to figure out a way to filter your own water, and it can be the best 4 months of your life. So there's really a lot to be said. If you like the people you're working with and you like the place, I would be hesitant to pass on something like that,
Right.
because you'll be happy. And if the work that you're doing is not fulfilling you long term, you're at least developing connections where you can find other opportunities to do that. Getting your foot in the door is like the hardest part of moving through an organization and finding new work inside of an organization. So if you're in and you're in a comfortable spot, I would value that.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah,
Sure.
thank you so much.
Yep.
Yeah, so I had like two quick questions. So the
Sure.
first one, wondering, I'm guessing like, is contamination control like also an aspect for like not just like satellites and telescopes, but for like other space missions like rovers or like
Yeah.
other explorers?
Yeah. So I focus on telescopes and satellites because here at the Goddard Space Flight Center, that's like our thing. But the other NASA centers do more of the rovers and the astronaut programs. So we occasionally at Goddard dabble into that, but it's not in like our general scope. So and there are contamination teams at the other centers as well. So you mentioned rovers. Um, there is part of the Artemis mission is to develop a rover to go on the moon to take people around. And the moon is very dusty, which can create a huge contamination problem if you have delicate instruments or mechanisms inside your rover that could jam up if dust gets inside. Or you have a rover that has a window on it and a camera on the inside, and you run your wheels, spray up all this dust, and now you've got a dusty window that your cameras can't see out of. So yes, there is contamination control involved in all of that. There are people who specialize in those. We do interact with them. Um, if they're NASA employees, we can just call them up, talk to them, send them a message on Teams, whatever. We often do that back and forth and share resources. We also host conferences. So here at Goddard, we have a conference every 2 years that we host for contamination control, thermal coatings, and planetary protection. Planetary protection is like a new kind of like a hot field here in space as we develop more spacecraft that go to other planets and other celestial bodies, or we plan to send people to Mars. We need to make sure that we're not introducing contaminants to those celestial bodies that could then throw off any local ecosystems on them. So that's a very like an up and coming part of contamination control right now, probably because NASA is planning long term to send people to Mars. And if you've seen the movie War of the Worlds, it's like the opposite, right? The aliens come to Earth and then Earth germs kill them. So what we don't want to do is send Earth germs to another celestial body and then screw it up. And then when we go to take science measurements from it, we've contaminated the sample we're trying to take. NASA brought back a sample from the asteroid Bennu back in September for the OSIRIS-REx mission, which was a Goddard mission. Basically sent a robot to the asteroid, had it scoop up some of the dust from the asteroid and bring it back to Earth. If we had introduced some sort of organism into that sample that we were collecting and we brought it back, like say an ant got in there, and then we bring this back and we find a dead ant in a sample from Bennu, the world would be up in arms that there are insects on this asteroid, but it's not true. And at the same time, we wouldn't want to introduce some organism that would then screw up the chemical compositions of that body too. Does that make sense?
Yeah. That's cool. Thanks.
Yep. So I do work, I do a little bit of consulting with our group at the Johnson Space Center in Houston that does work on lunar dust. And they are looking to us for specialized cleaning methods that could be automated in space, be it with like a windshield wiper type of thing. But one thing they need to develop is a way to test those devices on Earth. So we're actually informal talks about like converting one of our space simulation vacuum chambers into a dust chamber, basically trying to like recreate the surface of the moon on the floor of the chamber so that we could recreate the environment of the moon inside that and test mechanisms inside there. So, at Goddard, that's not our specialty because we specialized in programs that don't involve astronauts. But if we can like get our foot into stuff like that, we definitely will. And as the space industry moves more towards like focusing on astronaut travel and away from like just general satellites, it'll be good business for us to get into that too. So.
Oh, yeah, and then my second question was like, I was wondering, like, if at your current job, like, how useful, like, your physics degree was, or if it was, like, your internship that, like, mainly, like, helped you. I mean, I guess you said, like, you
Yeah.
learned on the job, but, like, do you, like, use, like, any, like, of the knowledge you, like, learned during college at your job? Or?
Yeah, I'm in a little bit more of a management role at this point, but it sort of sneaks in when you least expect it. So, when I was a junior engineer here, I don't know that I used like the astrophysics formulas that we learned how to derive as a junior engineer, but I was operating microscopes and had to project like data collection over courses of years and extrapolate data. Now, one thing that just came up is we're revisiting the contamination requirements that were developed for the Roman Space Telescope like 7 years ago, because they've removed some of the mirrors inside certain parts of it, and that changes the requirements of the other mirrors. And the original analysis was done like using matrices and how different parts of the telescope see other different parts of the telescope. So one phenomenon that happens in space is outgassing. you're not familiar with that, it's basically imagine a material just evaporating away very, very slowly on Earth, right? Like you have a block of dry ice. You go to a concert, there's dry ice, right? You see smoke everywhere. And it's a cool effect. And eventually that dry ice just completely dissipates. When you put something in space, that happens to a lot of other materials. And so we test materials to make sure they're not going to do that too much, but you can't avoid it altogether. So if you imagine like the guts of a telescope, the inside of a telescope, and you have this box inside, and it's going to outgas some small mass, at in a grams, like a nanograms per second rate. But over the course of 20 years, you want to know what that mass it's outgassing is going to deposit on. So you create a view factor matrix where you basically identify all the different surfaces that that box can see and how well it can see them. Uh, so if the box is hollow, but there's an aperture on one side, you're going to get all the outgassing from inside the box in that one direction. The back of it might only see like the case of the box. And so it gets really complicated when you add all these mechanisms and different mirrors and lenses inside of the telescope. And so you then have to prioritize which mirrors are going to be more important, which mechanisms are more important. And then you have to consider the temperatures of them. If you get into a cold car on a humid day, you know that your windshield's going to fog up because your windshield's very cold and it's condensing water that's in the air. Same thing happens in space. So matter that is outgases will like naturally flow towards cooler surfaces. Anyway, this can get very complicated, but my point is that you run these analyses by creating matrices. And I had to look at this analysis that was done before I joined Roman to update it and saw all these like multiplications and inverses of matrices. And I hadn't seen anything like that since I took linear algebra back at Lehigh and had to like reteach myself how to multiply matrices together and what the outcomes were. So the stuff sort of sneaks up on you. I think most important about your undergrad education, especially in a technical role, is sort of creating or refining your ability to think critically in a technical manner. So math is math, right? And if you're learning the math of physics, if you're learning how to program complex physics equations, you're going to be able to use those skills to evaluate other situations. They don't necessarily have to be the exact physics research that you did in school, but those skills do carry over. And most importantly, they make you think like critically about different systems like that. So occasionally when I talk to the scientists here, the astro stuff does come up, and being like my background in my group and the rest of my team on Roman in the contamination group, nobody else has an astro background. They were either chemical or bio backgrounds. I can understand what our scientists are telling us a little bit better because I have that educational background, and I then have to interpret it, especially the optics portion. But it's sort of like in the background, I'd say. If you go into research, it'll be front and center. But I chose not to go into research.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you.
Yep.
So you mentioned that when you first got your job, your supervisor, I think you said, threw you into the fire and
Yeah.
threw you into the fire to see who stuck around. At least in the beginning, before you started taking on like managerial roles, how difficult was it? Like, how stressful, or what was the work-life balance going into it?
So I'll answer those separately because they're a little different. Being thrown in the fire can be very stressful. I was like 24, 25 when I moved down here. And my first week, she sent me into the clean room to basically look at a piece of one of the instruments that had just arrived from a vendor and take some samples of it for evaluation. And I did what I was told, and I got reprimanded afterward because I didn't have a quality assurance person with me and I didn't have the proper paperwork printed out with me, and nobody told me I had to have that. And I thought for sure the next day I was getting fired. Because I'm like, here, I just broke this, quality management protocol. Like, how dare I? This is a major NASA mission. Um, I didn't get fired, and I just had to learn the process. And she apologized because she realized, she didn't even think twice about it at the time. But it didn't stop her from sending me right back in to interact with the other flight teams and to work on other flight hardware right away. There's a lot of, when you're a junior engineer, you get a lot of the grunt work too, a lot of the grunt lab work that can be very tedious. And you write reports that are distributed out to other engineers and scientists and management personnel that make their way up the chain. And so the way you present the data that you collect is very important. And I was able to figure out, like, through a little bit of mentorship and trial and error, like, ways to professionally present the data in an interpretable way for someone who was not really in my field. And it was one thing I excelled at, and that helped me too. But it took her having the faith in me to do that instead of having to have everything filtered through her before it got distributed out, to really let me sort of find my own footing and find my own place within the greater project team. There were other people who came in similar ways that I did, who didn't want to do the grunt work. They thought they were above it. They thought they shouldn't have to be doing it. And she did not like that, because she very much appreciated people who were willing to sort of um, cut their teeth first, but, like, what's the phrase I'm thinking of? Pay your dues on your way in. And those people didn't last very long on the team. So I now, as a team lead now, I try to, like, pay forward with my junior engineers the same opportunities that were paid to me. And, I give them ownership of different components of the telescope. So I have an engineer right now who I've made, like, the primary contamination engineer for the instrument carrier device of the telescope, basically the big web that's going to hold our two instruments onto Roman. And so when they're having formal technical meetings, when there are deliverables due, data's due, like, it's her show. I, gave her the opportunity, she runs with it, and she's doing wonderfully, and that will make her career here at Goddard. A micromanager would probably keep a junior engineer, like, buried in an office, and that person would have a harder time sort of developing their own path at an organization like this. I mean, there's 9,000 people that work here, so it's easy to sort of, like, fall underground. But you have to, on a project, a flagship mission, like, you kind of have to be able to weather some of the more stressful times. And if you can get through it and get used to it and develop the relationships with the other people who will then develop faith in you, then you can find a comfortable spot. So, a lot of the people that I'm working with on the Roman telescope, I worked with on James Webb, and that familiarity, like, if, if I fall behind on something, like, there's faith in that I won't have someone breathing down my neck. There's faith in that I will come back and I will turn around. So, and that goes in both directions too. So it's, yeah, being thrown in the fire, like, you need thick skin. I've worked with an array of personalities. And if you don't have the thickest skin, that's okay too. You just need to have, like, methods for handling high stress. Definitely find an outlet. I play drums, so if I have a really bad day, I'll go home and, like, bang around on my drums. That helps me. Or just, like, wrestle my kids, because they love that too. But uh, um, but the stress, like, dealing with that stress and sort of, like, showing that you can handle it and learning from it and learning how to handle it in a healthy way will allow you to be put in more, like, forward situations, give you more opportunities. You asked about work-life balance. Work-life balance at NASA and across the federal government is unbeatable. The government cannot match, like, the salaries of private industry. So by law, we can't. So the government has to sort of like make it up to retain people in other ways. And one of the ways is by adhering to a very strict work-life balance. So um, I work 40 hours a week and not a minute more than that. Um, I'm not encouraged to work any more than that. Nobody pushes you to work more than that. If there are overtime opportunities, you are compensated for that. But um, I have every right to just say no to an overtime, and I do that a lot. I have two young kids, so I need to make sure that I'm a present father. But um, if I were to like take my job and go work for SpaceX or Blue Origin or one of the other private companies, they would probably expect me to work closer to like 60 hours a week with no overtime pay because that's what the job entails. So um, their their structure is more get people when they're energized, work them till they're completely broken down, and then they choose to move on, and then just recycle that. Um, and I know people who've left here who go work for them because the salary is hard to turn down. And, for some people, it's fine. That's what they want to do with their life. They want to work all the time. It's not what I want to do. And for me, the government doesn't pay as well, but it doesn't pay poorly either. Um, so, yeah, so stress, work-life balance, when you're talking about the government, very different subjects for sure.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
That's good to know, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. I didn't think about like how in private companies probably expect you to work like overtime with no pay, and you don't really consider that, so thank you.
Yeah, it's good to you can read reputations on Glassdoor, um, talk to people who work at those companies, but it's when I interact with some people who work with the private companies, it's insane the hours they have to put in. We spent a couple of years at Northrop Grumman's facility in Los Angeles, in Redondo Beach, California, one of the most, I'm a beach guy, so it's one of the most beautiful places in the country. But the people who worked there never got to enjoy it because their work day started at 5:30 a.m. and they were there till 6 o'clock every night. And so, all right, okay, you live in a great area, you probably make a good amount of money, but you live at work. And for me, that's not something I could ever enjoy. I really like my job. I mean, who wouldn't, right? And I like being able to have time outside of work with my family and to keep up with hobbies and travel and enjoy the Washington, D.C. area as much as I can. So um, it is important to weigh that when you're considering where to work.
So I also had a quick question.
Sure.
So you were actually the second speaker in a row who dropped out of grad school.
No way. Okay.
That's honestly really inspiring because I guess many of us also have this stereotype in our heads that we just gotta go to grad school straight away. So I wonder can you elaborate a little bit more on your thought process during the grad school? Like, yeah, how was it?
So, I mean, a couple things. The financial side's really important. So, graduate school is expensive, and no matter what your stipend is, it's not going to offset what it's costing you to be there. So, Lehigh is very expensive. Um, I, as an undergrad, had a nice scholarship that helped me get through college, but the prospect of going to graduate school and having to take out loans and then repay those loans in an academia scholarship or academia salary afterward just terrified me. And especially if I wasn't really like passionate about the work anymore, it just didn't make sense financially for me to pay San Diego State University, the tuition, and pay for housing and pay for food and all that, and take out money to do that. And of course, you have to work part time, but it just didn't make any sense for me. And from the work side of it, um, I just didn't. I liked doing the research because I thought it was interesting, but I didn't see myself making much of a difference. And I didn't want to get buried in the idea of sitting in an observatory at night's really cool. But the idea of doing that every night for 4 months in the desert away from my family was not as enticing. And then being buried in a office where I was writing and doing the research and writing about it, and then having to sort of beg for grant money on top of that. It just, I didn't, it didn't make sense to me. Um, for plenty of people, it does. That's, everyone makes their own decisions and forecasts what they think is going to make them happiest in life. And that lifestyle just, to me, didn't seem like it was going to be appropriate. And because I didn't get those REUs, I didn't really get that taste as an undergrad of what life would look like in research. I got a taste of working at NASA Goddard and thought it was incredible and wanted that. So when I got to graduate school and started learning about what it would take to do research professionally and work in academia, I looked at one experience from the summer before where I had an amazing time at an amazing place, and looked at this and weighed the options together and decided it wasn't worth the commitment that I was about to sign on for. So I did, sit through my first few classes and do my first few assignments, but it didn't last very long. And once I made the decision, I called my mother and like told her about it, and she's like, just drop out, just do it, just get back in your car and come back east. And so I did. And I'm glad she kicked my butt a little bit for it, but I learned.
Thank you.
I had a very good friend when I was an undergrad who graduated from the Astro program with me. She went on to graduate school and did research in Chile and Puerto Rico, and is now like the head of the planetary research group at the Southwest Research Institute. And she went the research way, and it worked out beautifully for her, and she's so happy and loves it. I think the Lehigh Alumni Magazine did a feature on her not too long ago. Tracy Becker, if you can get a meeting with her, that would be great too. And she's awesome, and it worked out beautifully for her, and we went in 2 different routes, and we both ended up very happy. So it's got to work out right for you. Yeah.
That's really interesting you said that. I think Tracy Becker is the next speaker I have planned.
Oh, no way. Okay. We have to tell her I said hi.
Well,
Yeah. We were neighbors down on Walford Street too.
small world.
Yeah.
I had a question about, I guess, moving up in the ranks. I like the idea of like, I guess, an engineering job where I'm hands-on, I get to do stuff, even if there's grunt work involved and all that. I'm not as excited about the idea, I guess, of a managerial role and getting away from the lab work. I guess it's part of maybe a two-pronged question. Is it always necessary to go down a managerial role to move up in a company? And what are the pros and cons of moving to a more managerial role?
So the first answer to your question is no. There's really 2 routes you take as an engineer. You either go into the management leadership side, or you go become a subject matter expert, where you become like the engineer in your field, or one of the like top staff engineers for your organization in your field. And that is going to be purely technical role. And that's where, you're expected to do a little bit of research on top of your industry work, but, present papers at conferences, things like that. Make your organization look good. If it's a private company, probably work on getting some patents for your company too. Or you go the management side, where in my case, I still retain a lot of the technical work, but I do have like team lead responsibilities. So I do manage some budgets, manage some schedules. I oversee a team of 9 engineers and about 9 technicians right now. So, writing performance evaluation feedback for them is part of it. I'm pretty extroverted. I like being surrounded by people. So the prospect of like managing people doesn't really turn me off at all. The more people I can talk to, the better for me. So I don't mind doing the write-ups. It fulfills me a bit when my teammates get awards at NASA from write-ups I've done for them. That makes me feel really good. So you generally don't start to feel out which way you're going until you've been at a place for 10 years, like you're 10 years into your career. And at that point, it'll start to feel natural. So at the government, at least here at Goddard, for the engineering group, they have a career map. And as you go up the general schedule scale, which dictates our pay, you go from, usually come in at like a 7, and then it goes all the way up through 15. When you are in your 13, when you're about a level 13, that's when you sort of start to feel out if you want to go into management, if you want to go into like institutional management. So not just being like a technical supervisor, but like, running the space center or something. Or you want to be a subject matter expert. And at least at NASA, there are programs that you can enroll in where you get a feel for each one of those so that you can make an informed decision. So Goddard has some internal ones, and then the NASA agency has some larger ones as well. And so for me, as I moved up, it sort of came naturally. I kind of figured it out. And in my experience talking with other people, it's been the same for them too. So as an undergrad, an entry-level engineer, I wouldn't even think about it. It's something you'll figure out as you spend more time in your career.
Okay, that makes sense. So is it safe to say you plan on staying at NASA like indefinitely right
Yeah.
now?
Yeah, I love it here. I love NASA's mission overall. After this telescope launches, the next big one is called the Habitable Worlds Observatory, which, like, even in name for me, like, that could be such a breakthrough mission to work on. It'd be really cool to work on that. And when James Webb launched, and the first images started to come back, and like all of the chaos and celebration that happened with it, it was like really rewarding to see that something I worked on was getting that much recognition, but also like that the science community was just like mind blown over some of the discoveries coming through. So I love it here. I don't think the grass is necessarily greener anywhere else at this point. I I'm still friends with, I'm still very tight with about 20 of my friends from Lehigh. I talk to my friends from Lehigh daily, most of them. Some people have had very weird career paths. Some people are not happy. They're worked way too much. I'm not one of them, and I'm happy to like be cognizant of that. And so to give this up would be incredibly difficult. Um, Now, NASA has a lot of centers. My wife and I have talked about like possibly moving, and I would work at one of the other centers if possible. Um, that's something we might do. But as far as NASA itself, I don't think I could leave. I'm too happy here. Yeah.
Makes sense. It's a bit off topic, but could you, I guess, explain a little bit of details about the Nancy Roman telescope and I guess how it's
Yeah.
different from UST, what it's going to be looking for?
Yeah. So, okay. James Webb is a near and mid infrared space telescope that is out at L2. It's a cryogenic space telescope, so its optics and instruments are working at cryo. They're very cold. We have that gigantic sun shield basically making sure that the sun doesn't warm any of it up. And James Webb's shtick, its like number one science requirement is to sort of fill in the cosmological gap that was left between Hubble and some of the other telescopes that were out very near to the Big Bang. So looking for first light is the primary objective of James Webb, which means you have to have a very cold telescope to be able to see through some of the matter that's in the way. Very cool when the first image came out because I studied a little bit of gravitational lensing as an undergrad, and at the time it was like mostly just theoretical. And then the first picture came out, and you could see evidence of lensing in it. Like for me, that was really really cool. Nancy Roman is a survey telescope, so its primary objective is to take large pictures of the sky all at once. So James Webb is very focused. It picks an object in the sky, it focuses on it, And it's a very small part of the sky that it captures, but you can get bigger detail because you're focusing on a small part of the sky. Nancy Roman is trying to take a much wider view of the sky, not necessarily looking at specific targets, but taking a survey image of the sky that astronomers can then filter the data through to find things within that larger image. So it used to be called WFIRST, the Wide Field Infrared Space Telescope. It is looking in the infrared just like James Webb, and it is going to L2, the same location as Webb. But because it's a survey telescope and not necessarily looking for like first light, the optics don't have to be cold. The optics instruments don't have to be as cold as James Webb. So we also don't need a mirror. We can use a much smaller mirror. James Webb's mirror was like 6 meters across. It's huge. So big that we couldn't put a cover on it. And we had to fold it up just to fit it in the rocket. Nancy Roman's is like 1.2 meters across. It's much smaller. It has a lens cap, and it's basically looks like a big can with wings. So it looks much more like the Hubble Space Telescope than it does James Webb. So this, there is also a tech demonstration instrument, a coronagraph instrument on it that JPL built. NASA does tech demos for new technology where you can put a new instrument onto a satellite to test it out in space, but it doesn't contribute to the requirements of that mission. So it's kind of like tagging along to see if it works. And if it can demonstrate functionality, then they can get a larger mission where that is the primary objective. So JPL built a coronagraph instrument to look at stars and help filter out the corona light to look at exoplanets. That's what that one is looking for. So we will get good exoplanet data provided their instrument works, which it should, since it's going through a ton of testing, on top of just the larger surveys of it. But so not as cold, not necessarily looking back as far in time, but capturing a lot more of the sky at once than James Webb does. So inside Nancy Roman, the detector array, which ultimately captures the light and turns it into data, is 9 times the size of that of James Webb, even though the mirror is 1/6 of the size.
Pretty interesting. Thank you.
Yep.
Well, if nobody else has any questions, I don't want to keep you any longer. I know you got kids to get back to.
Yeah, I do, yes.
So much for coming to talk to us.
Thank you.
Wait, everyone look up to the left because that's what I see.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for inviting me, and I hope you enjoy your other talks, and I wish everyone the best of luck. And if you have questions, please reach out. I think Daniel has my contact information, so you're all welcome to reach out anytime. And if you find yourself in the area, come by. I'll give you a tour.
Okay.
Thank you so
Thank you
much.
so much.
Yep.
Guys, love you too. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.